Hello and welcome to the Film Theories lecture series. Today I'm going to talk about film genre. Genre is an interesting topic because this is probably one of the first things that you know about a film. Maybe you don't know the director, maybe you don't recognize the actors, but you will know the genre and you will choose the film based on the genre, based on your mood, which matches that kind of genre or goes against it. I'm going to discuss the topic in two chunks. First, I'm going to talk about the literary origin because this is somehow influential in film theory as well. And then I switch to the filmic part, film theory and criticism. As with many of the things, we need to go back to the Greeks. Aristotle was the first to tackle the question of genre, and he was basically describing the genres, the literary genres that were available and widely spread in ancient Greece. He created a model for talking about genre, and his method is considered to be what we call today as descriptive method. Later on comes Horace. He was also talking about poetry, literary genres, but he approached it a bit differently. He was building on Aristotle's findings, and he was definitely using the descriptions by Aristotle, but he was building on it, and he was kind of telling poets how to write poetry, how to be an author, basically. Now, his method is considered to be a kind of a prescriptive method. That is, he prescribed how to fit into certain generic categories. Interestingly, for centuries, these two approaches remain the basic methods of talking about genre. When it comes to film, basically these two trends are translated as receptive categories and production categories. In other words, one goes for spectators and the other goes for filmmakers. In literary theory and criticism, the significant change in tackling the issue of genre comes around the 50s, 60s, and 70s perhaps. One of the most influential works that we used to mention here is René Wallach and Austen Warren's theory of literature from the 50s, 56 I believe, in which they create formal categories to discuss and to study genre. In this new approach, they give us two sides of discussing genre. One is called the inner form. This is basically the attitude, the tone, and the purpose of the literary work. The other is the outer form. This is the specific meter or structure of the work that we read or meet. It is a very straightforward critical attitude, but it has its problems, unfortunately, just as many of the branches in genre theory. Number one, Wallach and Warren and others take it for granted that genres do exist. They are somewhere out there. Number two, genres have firm boundaries according to these approaches. There's no crisscrossing, there's no genre bending. We have set genre categories and they cannot be crossed. Obviously, there are many other problems as well. We list a couple of them in the book. What is problematic here is that they limit the reading and interpretation of a specific literary text. But perhaps the most problematic aspect of these types of approaches is that they take an original and then they treat every other text as imitations of that particular original one. They focus on internal attributes, inner forms, to tackle issues which are not really entirely observable, and where it really becomes cumbersome is when you start to study certain texts and you realize that certain generic texts produce systematically very similar generic texts, and at the end of it, it becomes really boring. Film theory becomes interested in the issues of genre only in the late 60s, early 70s. As you know, this is the era when film studies becomes an academic discipline. There are two approaches that we see in film studies coming out of this era. One is based on Aristotle's descriptive method. That is, it becomes a kind of a label, it becomes a category for product differentiation. That is, a category for reception. The other approach is very similar to Horace's prescriptive method, and this is used in categorizing genres in mass production, especially in the studio era, if you come to think of it. Genres rely on a prescribed set of motifs, character types, visual style, music, and thematic context. Especially when you come to think of it in today's marketing terms, genre becomes a kind of a brand. Genre not only identifies and propagates certain types of films, but also it raises audience expectations for tiny little changes from film to film. Genre analysis in the 70s and 80s basically inherits many attributes and methods from cultural myth analysis. What they base their studies on is the same structural patterns that cultural myth analysis was interested in. In other words, they were studying basic structural patterns which unfold in the form of binary oppositions within culture and within a thematic context. Think of Western as a genre, for example. It permeates all aspects of US culture. It articulates a national mythology for Americans. This myth is informed by a deep structure composed of underlying binary oppositions. On the one hand, you have culture, garden, settler, civilized. And on the other hand, you have nature, wilderness, nomad, savage. The vocabulary of genre analysis still relies to some extent on the literary origins, the literary inheritance. For example, when critics tend to use the iconography of a genre or iconography of film, they often go back to René Wellek and Austen Warren's idea of inner and outer form to base their study on. There are some divergent views, however, that focus on specifically filmic cinematic reception and production phenomena. According to Thomas Schatz, for example, genre can be understood as a form of cultural ritual. It helps integrate a conflictual society through either romance or through a character who mediates between rival factions within that culture. Schatz identifies two basic types of genres. One type is reestablishing social order. For example, Western or detective movies, they aim to reestablish social order by the end of the story, by the end of the film. The other type advocates social integration. Here we usually mention musicals or comedies, where usually we have an outcast character who becomes integrated into society, gaining a social status, social subjectivity, or acceptance. Also, he does not really believe in the static nature of genre. He believes that genre is developing. All kinds of genres are developing, and usually they develop through four distinct stages. The first stage is what we call experimental period. Here there are no limits, there are no boundaries. Filmmakers are experimenting, they are trying to see what the audience wants and what they want to do, so they do experiment. Second, we have the classical period where we already have established and somewhat firm boundaries for genres, and films keep on repeating and repeating, reusing different types and different parts of the specific genre. Now, after a while, this becomes really boring, and then we get to the third stage, which Schatz calls decline. The decline stage is really what it says. This is when a genre becomes really boring. When we get to this stage, basically there's no innovation within genre. But when we get to the next stage, which is called self-reflexive stage, irony appears. They start to overemphasize rules, overrepresent specific characteristics of the given genre. It is a very innovative retake on the issues of the genre, on the basic foundational aspects of that particular genre, and it may result in rebooting that particular genre. If there's a reboot, then obviously we get back to the experimental stage, and then we go through the four stages again and again and again. Another divergent view or trend within genre criticism in film is when we are less interested in visual characteristics or inner forms, and we tend to look into something completely different. Steve Neal, for example, warns us that genres are never innocent. They are usually considered to be as vehicles for ideology. Since mass film production relies on the prescriptive method, it reinforces social models, the distribution of gender roles, for example, or ethical moral rules, and it creates what we call preferred readings. Preferred readings are basically pre-coded interpretations, like tiny little story capsules that make it easier for the spectator to understand what the film wishes to convey. Studying this aspect of genre definitely broadens the scope and extends the boundaries of genre criticism and analysis. So much about film genre. Thank you for your attention. Stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.